So I'm come from the Morton Partnership. We're a firm of structural engineers predominantly, and we are the lead consultant for upcoming works at Priory House. I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself and what we're doing at Priory House, and then you will be able to see, you know, as the works commence, what a bit more about the background. So I, as a structural engineer, specialise in historic buildings, which is quite unusual as a structural engineer. I've been working over the past 16 years, and more recently I'm honoured to be the project engineer at Canterbury Cathedral, also working on perhaps a comparable building at the Priory Church in Royston, which was badly damaged by fire a couple of years ago. So I am, just a little bit of a plug, what's called a conservation accredited engineer, and there are very, very few specialist engineers that work in historic buildings. So if you ever, you know, looking for one for your own house or for, you know, for a project, looking for a conservation accredited engineer. So just a little plug there. Priory House and the High Street HAS scheme, so High Street Heritage Action Zone scheme, which I'm sure you've all heard a lot about already, but Priory House is the kind of anchor project as part of that scheme, which has attracted money for funding to carry out repairs. So what we've been doing as part of that is a programme of investigations and research to develop some technical proposals. So I'm going to outline those very briefly and talk about what's coming next. So Priory House, as I'm sure many of you are very familiar with, my intention today is not to go into the history of which, you know, the medieval Dunstable have done a huge amount of work, and Jean Yates's book, but more to tell you a little bit about how that's relevant to the work we're doing today. And I'm going to stick very much to my own expertise as a structural engineer and not to try and stray into others' fields too much. But you know, as is already said, the oldest part of the building dates back to the early 13th century, and much of this fabric is still evident in the Undercroft. But the building has been enveloped by later changes, and much of these occur in the 18th century and again in the 19th century. Major programme of work in 2004, it became the Heritage Centre, an exhibition space and wedding venue and tea room that it is today. It's a grade 2-star listed building, and what that means is it's been identified as a particularly important building of more than special interest, of which just under 6% of buildings that are listed fall into that category. It's a sort of little awkward category in its own right. The sort of grade 1 tends to be for very grand buildings, cathedrals, or very unusual buildings of the type. Grade 2 tends to be for sort of perhaps more domestic scale, or perhaps more where there are more examples, and this sort of awkward little 2-star category in the middle. And what that means for us is any works to the building need to gain listed building consent, and that process is done in consultation with the local authority, Central Bedfordshire, but with Historic England as statutory consultees. So Priory House is not without its problems. It's for those of you who've sat there and enjoyed a cup of tea and stared up at the stonework will see that it's got a beautiful aesthetic quality, but it has got some problems. Parts of it are crumbling away, and what we've seen here, you can see in the photo here, is the surface of the stonework has been lost. We can also see a huge history of patchwork of repairs in different stones, in mortars, and you know, an array of original stones as well that relate to the original building. It's got challenges with water, as many historic buildings do, and we can see here up at high level with water problems, water ingress from the gutters, and challenges with the facades as well. What we, with historic buildings, look to do is keep is honour the use of traditional materials, looking at limes and trying to keep everything compatible with the original fabric. Where Priory House has had some challenges is where incompatible materials have been used in the past, modern paint systems, cementitious additives into the render. And the building, we use the term breathe. It's not really breathing as such, but it can't equilibrate, and you know, it results in the moisture coming out where you don't want it to. So I'm going to explain a little bit more about some of those challenges as we go on. So the project that we're trying to address as part of this scheme of works is to repair and conserve the stonework of the vaulting, and that's the intention, is to keep it in situ to the, you know, every effort that we can, and only intervening in a sort of very delicate way where we need to. We've also spent a lot of time on research to better understand the environmental conditions, the fabric itself, the phasing of the building, the archaeology. So again, I'll explain a little bit more in high level what we've done there. And the overall intention is for the building to stay as it is, in the ownership of Dunstable Town Council, as a tea room and, you know, successful venue that it is today, but to remove it from the Heritage at Risk register where it stands at the moment. So the project team is a huge amount. I couldn't quite believe the number of parties involved when I put this slide together. And again, not the time today to explain who everyone is and what we're all doing, but the team has come together with various technical specialists in their own field, and that's working in, you know, with the building owner and our client, Dunstable Town Council, Central Bedfordshire as the you know, statutory governing body, Historic England, and then an array of consultants who all have their specialists, ranging from archaeology through to building services, stonework, architecture, and also environmental monitoring. So a huge amount of expertise. And the idea of the project has been based around understanding and research. And what we can see here is an orthographic survey of the stonework. So if you can imagine you were lying on your back in the floor of the Undercroft and you had a perfect rectified view, dead on, of all of it. So it's not a very true view of, but you know, if you were looking upwards, lying on your back, that's what you would see. So the idea of this is to capture as much information as we can about what's there now, and we can zoom into this in a great amount of detail and see. We can see every joint in the webs and in the stonework. We can see all its warts and fissures. We can see the original mason's marks that were there, and that's all captured in a lot of detail. As part of that, we've had an archaeologist working, and we brought in Jackie Hall to have a look at the Undercroft stonework in particular, and her work has fed into a broader piece of research and recording by HB Archaeology and Conservation to understand the phasing of the building. And what we are really concerned about with this project is working around the medieval core of the building. And this project, the sort of key thing about this project is the changes that went on in the 18th century to the facade. And what the eagle-eyed amongst you will spot is that the walls are much thicker on these three sides of the building than they are on the front. And it's that refacing in the 18th century that has nibbled away at the depth of the stonework. And what that means structurally is something I will explain in a minute with a different slide. But that's this refacing, I think, is the sort of cause of some of the troubles the Undercroft has seen today. The other investigative works we've been doing are around the building environment. This is with Tobic Curtis Associates, who advise on a number of historic buildings. And we've been very closely over the last year monitoring the environmental conditions within the building. So if you enjoying your cup of tea and you look up in some of the corners, you'll see little white white boxes, and what they're doing with a little aerial is they are monitoring the environmental conditions within the Undercroft. And coupled with that, we've got rods within the wall, wooden dowels, which is very simple technology, but measures the saturation, the amount of water within the walls, and we can monitor over the course of time what's going on with water in the walls. You can see these sort of heat maps here, and this is looking at the south wall, and it's basically, you can tell from the colours, you can read it as it shows the bits at the bottom are the wet bits, the cold bits, and that's where the problems are occurring. Separate to that, we've been looking, so this is where a bit more onto my comfort zone at the structure of the Undercroft. These are as if you'd got a knife and sliced through the Undercroft, firstly at the position of the arches, and then secondly at midpoint, so this is the rib in the middle. And what we can see is the High Street South here, those of you who are very perceptive will see that the west wall of the Undercroft leans very slightly towards the High Street. And as looking at those slices, we can see that movement in the west wall, and it translates itself through that geometry and into the shape of the vaults. And that's essentially where we see the problems on the vaults with the deterioration in stonework. So the vaults themselves they're predominantly from the Tottenham stone, the ribs and piers, and with a whiter chalk infill. And chalk is a material that doesn't like to have mechanical stresses exerted on it. So where it's just had a very slight distortion is where we see the problems occurring, and that corresponds very well. Also, it has sort of some added demands where from the exhibition space above, partitions from the 18th and from the 19th century plonk themselves directly on the area where it's most stressed. Later on in recent history, some well-intended interventions to try to deal with water issues from the High Street, so a French gravel drain on the High Street side and a lump of concrete on the inside. And all of those modern interventions were well intended, but as we know, concrete and historic buildings don't mix. And actually what we've seen is a concentration of water into that drain at the front, trapped against the concrete, and again the condition of the walls is deteriorating at the base. So it's really, really important that we intervene at this point in time to reverse that. So we've also had a condition survey, sort of stone by stone, from this is David Odgers here, who's a stone consultant. He's taken samples of the stone and of the mortar, and we've also gone to the Clark's quarry at Tottenham. Those of you who saw in the earlier presentation, the entrance to the Tottenham quarry was into the face of a cliff, down deep. And originally the stone was mined. Tottenham quarry today, as you can see, is very much not down into the depths of the cliff, but it's an open cast mine, a very small quarry with just a man and a digger, really. It's underwater for most of the year, and this is some of the Tottenham stone that comes out. So it's very different to the historic Tottenham that was quarried from depth, with the advantage of the layers and layers upon it. They quarry out, this is a lump of the Tottenham, and this is the sort of chalk that they can quarry out today. And they describe this as blackboard chalk, and they literally sell it for that reason. So we've looked at the the sources of stone for carrying out these repairs and matched as best we can, but even though we are likely sourcing from the same quarry, not the same kind of material. So again, I'll come on to talk a little bit about the types of interventions, and I'm going to do this at fairly high speed. So we call them an intervention because we are, what we're not trying to do is change or, change anything in a kind of refurbishment or redevelopment kind of way. We're just intervening to try to stop the problem of what's happening. And we always look to treat the kind of symptom, the cause, not just the symptom of a problem. So in the Undercroft, looking at areas like this where the stones are badly decayed, and what we will be looking to do is replace patches of stone where there's accelerated decay, where there are poor quality mortar repairs, where they've mixed up sand and lime and stone and tried to kind of match in with the stone, and it's quite a poor visual match, and we'll be trying to take those off and get a better match, and some of these greyer mortars here as well, which don't well match. Again, those of you, the eagle-eyed, will have spotted there's a few acro props hiding in there. You can probably see the one. There's actually another one hidden within the east wall as well. And this is where the arch itself is become so flat, it's actually decompressed. And we've got a prop to hold that up, but these groups of stones will need to be reset back into compression. So it's a really sort of pick and mix, a gentle approach of a kind of shopping list of repairs to suit what we find there. But the intention is to retain this really important medieval fabric to the greatest extent that we can, and to retain the character and the appearance of the structure. To do that, any of you who saw the arch building activity will realise it's impossible to get a stone out of an arch from the underside. The only way you could do it is from above. So where we need to get to a little group of stones, we effectively have to excavate part of the floor from above and dig down and do that work from above. What we don't want to do is insert lots of metal pins and things to hold it all together, which are working against the force of gravity. This is obviously a very disruptive activity. It will be done under archaeological watching brief and minimised to the extent that we can. So only looking at the areas that are in particularly poor condition. And again, trying to get rid of some concrete that was put in the recent decades as well, that we believe is holding moisture against the stonework. Much less required in terms of the repairs to the walls and the piers, and you'll see that some of the cementitious plaster has been taken off to allow the walls to dry, and it creates quite an interesting story in itself of understanding what we can see in the arrangements of stones and bricks and mortar joints. What we can also see is we've got a lot of salt activity, so salt's coming out of the stone as it dries. So the idea is we've taken, prior to this project, some of the cementitious plasters have come off already to try and let that dry, and that process will continue, and eventually it will have a new coat of lime plaster back over it that will enable it to breathe and equilibrate with its surroundings. Replacing the heating system, I won't elaborate too much, but just to say that it's a bit of a soggy mess of wood shavings and shingle under there, which you may not appreciate from sipping your cup of tea, but just to put in something very similar, but with some ventilation into the subfloor. And then perhaps rather intriguingly, so again, the eagle-eyed amongst you will have seen there's some squares of board over some patches in the facade, and what that's covering is some earlier investigative work that we've done to take off patches of the render. We've done that in 2 locations. It's a very thick, hard render again that's trapping moisture against the stone and causing it to deteriorate, particularly at the lower levels. And we can see, you know, there's been various attempts over the course of time to patch it up, and someone's kind of slopped PVA glue over it and bits of rusty mesh and things like that. So it's really important with these works that we get it right, that we don't put in modern materials that interfere with the fabric of the building. And then quite simply, as I say, we've got to deal with the causes of the problem and not just the symptoms. So some of the causes are around incompatible materials, but other causes are just very simple around water management and making sure that the water can get away from the building. The high street drainage works will hopefully help hugely with the sudden downpours of rain and flooding into Priory House, with the idea that we can hopefully get away with removing these flood barriers. But unfortunately, over long course of time, the road levels have built up and up and up and are now well above the threshold to Priory House. So it's very, very vulnerable to water coming in just from surface. That is essentially the scheme of works. What's next? Well, we've gained listed building consent for those works, and we will be sending out technical information to contractors to take on the job. So hoping to start in September, and I'm sure there will be lots of opportunities to engage with people then as well. It will be something that we don't want to happen behind closed doors. It will be a very interesting programme of work, and we will go from there. So I think that's all I had to say. It's a bit of a whirlwind, not quite on the same theme as what the previous talk was, but yeah, as I say, thought I'd stick with my expertise. So yeah, thank you very much.